So we're going to be continuing some of the ideas from the last section, which was talking about X-linked disorders. Now we're going to be talking about autosomal genetic disorders. So if you have an X-linked disorders, that means if you have an X-linked disorder, that means that it's a disorder on your X chromosome. You can also think of that as being on your sex chromosome. And so when I'm saying X-linked, by the way, I'm not saying sex-linked. But those are disorders that are on your sex chromosomes, your X, or even potentially your Y. So, sorry about that. So these autosomal disorders are different than those X-linked ones. Okay, so like I was saying before, your sex-linked or your X-linked disorders, if you have two X's, you have an extra chromosome there to be able to compensate for maybe a deleterious allele that you have. If you don't, if you have an X and a Y like I do and a lot of guys, or all guys have, you're not going to be able to compensate for it. But these are autosomal recessive, so these work a little bit different. These are not going to affect one sex more than they are the other. An example of an autosomal recessive disorder is this thing called sickle cell anemia, and it's a mutation in the gene for the beta chain production of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a component of your blood that allows you to actually transport oxygen and get blood to your different cells. You don't have to worry about that it's a beta chain protein. But if you have a hemoglobin S individual, you have a substitution of one amino acid causing the chain to coalesce into crystals that distort the red blood cells, and they wind up looking like sickles. So if you have one S allele and one normal A allele, you don't have the condition, but you're called a carrier because you can pass that on to your offspring. 8% of African Americans are carriers, or they're also called heterozygous, as we've been talking about in lab. There's a few other conditions that are autosomal recessive. So again, in order to actually have these conditions, you need to have two recessive alleles. Okay, you need to have two recessive alleles. And cystic fibrosis is the most common genetic disorder. 1 in 25 Americans are carriers. And we also have this disease called Tay-Sachs disease, which is a really horrible disease. It's usually found in Jewish Americans from Central Europe. And 1 in 30 is a carrier. And again, the only way to actually get these diseases is to have two carriers get together, and 25% of their kids are going to have this because they're heterozygous if they're carriers, right? Both parents have to have the allele in order for a child to be born with the condition, like we've talked about ad nauseum in lab. If you have to get together with someone else who's a carrier or somebody else who has the condition to have it. And even if you are a carrier, only 1 in 4 of your children are actually going to wind up with the full-blown condition. So here you have a mother and a father, each of whom are heterozygous for this condition, this sickle cell condition. This is what a sickle cell phenotype looks like. Okay, and you can see only 1 in 4 of their children are going to actually wind up having this condition. But the reason that you wind up with sickle cell so often is because it provides an advantage. If you have sickle cell anemia, it makes you resistant to malaria. So because you are resistant to malaria, even though maybe some of your blood cells are going to wind up being a little bit messed up, it's still going to make it more likely that you're going to live for longer. So because of this parasite, this malaria parasite, which is spread by the Anopheles mosquito, can get into your bloodstream, and some of the life cycle of that parasite has to be spent in human red blood cells. Because some of your red blood cells are going to be slightly damaged, it provides you some resistance, and so it actually provides you a huge advantage if you live in sub-Saharan Africa. And the next thing to talk about is these autosomal dominant genetic disorders. So again, autosomal, this is talking about your non-sex cells. So again, you've got 46 chromosomes. 2 of them are X and Y, 2 of those are sex, and the other 44 are autosomal. So autosomal dominant diseases are diseases that you get if you just wind up with one allele. Huntington disease or Huntington's disease is a degenerative neural disorder, and it is it is autosomal. It is dominant. If you have one letter, you wind up with it. Lou Gehrig's disease is also a degenerative neural disorder. If you wind up with one of the alleles, you get it. And single faulty allele of a good gene causes damage, even if there is a good allele present. And we can talk about that right here. So the people that are going to wind up with this condition is anybody that winds up with a big letter H here. And so these two offspring are going to wind up with the condition, whether this is Lou Gehrig's or Huntington's. And then these two are going to not wind up with the condition because they have little h's. So we've talked about pedigrees in lab, and I'm probably going to even do another video just about pedigrees themselves. But geneticists, I almost said genealogists use these too, but geneticists use these family tree diagrams, also called pedigrees, to determine if the disorder is dominant or recessive and the probability of it being passed on. So the example is albinism. We've already talked about the symbols, and we've talked about what like the marriage line means and the sibling lines mean. But you can use some of these logical processes to determine who's going to be a carrier. So here is a pedigree for albinism. And here we didn't really do this in class, but the carriers have half a blue line. Okay, so albinism, you have to have the recessive phenotype, or you have to have the recessive genotype in order to have the condition. So anybody who doesn't have the condition, you know for a fact, has at least one big A. And this person who does have the condition, their parents don't have the condition, they have a blue line, so they're just carriers, but you know immediately that they're heterozygous, because like we discussed in class, they're going to have these little A alleles to pass on. But we know they don't have two little A alleles because they would be albino. Okay, so we know this person has it, we know their phenotype immediately just from kind of looking at them. We know this person has it, so we know these parents are heterozygous, we know this person's genotype, we know these parents are heterozygous, and we know this person's phenotype as well. So again, you can use these pedigrees, these family trees, in order to have some diagnostic power in order to see who's a carrier and who is potentially going to pass the gene on. So there are some different chromosomal aberrations, and I'm actually going to talk about these in the next video. Issues with chromosomes.